Is now open. Welcome to meeting number 33 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology.
2022, the committee is meeting to study Bill C-235, an act respecting the building of a green economy in the prairies. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. Pour les membres dans la salle, si vous souhaitez prendre la parole.
For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. It's a pleasure for me to see you all again after the summer. It's the first meeting of the session, and it's a great pleasure for me to have the Honourable Jim Carr with us today. Without further ado, Mr. Carr.
Hi, everybody. I want to start by saying it's a pleasure to appear in front of you, because I have learned, especially over the last number of months, that parliamentary committees are the pulse, the heartbeat of Parliament. And I honor the work that you do. You may think that it's odd that to discuss the future of the prairie, I'm going to start in 1901. We have spent the last number of weeks mourning the loss of a monarch, but very few people will know that on the day that Queen Victoria died, Winston Churchill was in Winnipeg. And he looked out the window towards the west, and he said in correspondence with his mother that day, in January of 1901, that someday this land will feed the world. Little did he know that it wouldn't just be what we grow, it won't just be the food supply that's so essential for all of us, but that a bushel of canola might be as powerful as a barrel of oil. And it is this sense of promise, of discovery, of building an economy from the ground up that has distinguished the contribution of Prairie Canada to the national economy, and the international demands that we are meeting all of the time. It's a very special part of the country, not only for me because I was born and raised there, but for people who appreciate this relationship between natural resources that have fueled economic development in the region and the country, and the intellectual firepower that's a part of it. I've always thought that stereotypes are dangerous because they are barriers to progress. And you say the word Alberta or Saskatchewan, you may get a stereotype that comes to your mind, but I bet you it's not Michael Houghton. Michael Houghton, who is a Nobel Prize laureate, who works at the University of Alberta, and who was given the Nobel Prize for his discovery of vaccines and hepatitis C. So I would prefer, if people think of stereotypes in Alberta, they think of Nobel laureates, rather than whatever else they may have in their mind. But it's a tribute to the diversity and the intellectual firepower of the prairie economy. I won the lottery in appearing in front of you today. And now I know why. When somebody wins the lottery, there are all kinds of people who want to talk to them about the best use of their proceeds. And when it became apparent that I was lucky enough to be able to appear in front of you, people have all kinds of ideas of how I should use the slot. But I did have an idea of my own, and it was to build on the work that we had done across the prairie through the lens of how can we align the interests of governments, the private sector, academic institutions, the working class, in order to give ourselves a better chance to move this file ahead. And look at the diversity of what we're dealing with here. It's the natural resource of the production of energy in all of its forms. It's agriculture and value-added agriculture. It's the life sciences. It's how we manage water across our region. And the only thing that gets in our way, really, are the limits of our imagination and the barriers that we erect for ourselves. And that's what this bill is all about. It's to reduce those barriers by mandating, by requiring ministers of the federal government to report back to Parliament about the framework that they have constructed in order to better align those policies. This is not a jurisdictional grab to maybe preempt some questions. This is within the federal jurisdiction. But the federal government reaching out to counterparts in the provinces, in the municipalities, in the unions, in NGOs, because we all have a stake in writing the next chapter of the prairie economic history. And I don't think that the template that's in this bill is exclusively regional. I think that if this becomes Canadian law, and I hope it will, that there will be examples for other regions of the country whose inhabitants feel as passionately about their region as I feel about mine. I see this as promise, as a possibility of working not at loggerheads, not in opposition, either motivated by ideology or a special interest, but looking for alignment around the common interest. So this bill, I think, is a modest expression of what is possible. When I was first asked by people what I thought the influence of this bill might be, my answer was somewhere between absolutely zero to changing the way we do business as a nation. We'll see where the truth lies, but I'm betting it'll be somewhere in between. But the first step is to agree that this framework will have to be reported back to you, reported back to Parliament within a reasonable period of time, and that it is that framework which will drive the future chapters that we will write together as prairie folk and as Canadians. And it says that we're not going to leave partnerships to chance. We're not going to leave them to the ambitions of any one government, any level of government, or one industry, or one union. Its aspiration is to align the interests of all of us. It's not pie in the sky, it's pragmatic, because what we seek to do is create wealth. We spend a lot of time in our country talking about how we are going to distribute wealth. That is a primary function of the public sector. It's important that we have rigorous debates about it, but where's the wealth coming from? Who's creating the wealth? And how do we create the conditions where that wealth can be created sustainably, with an eye on trends that will drive future public policy and investment decisions? So that's what we seek to achieve. I know that we have most of an hour to engage in debate. I am really looking forward to that, Mr. Chair. It's a chance for us to think together about the best way that we can achieve this common aspiration. So with those few words of introduction, I truly welcome the conversation. Thank you.
Yep. Very eloquent presentation as expected from you, Mr. Carr. So thank you very much. And without further ado, let's start this conversation with MP Michael Cram for 6 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today, Mr. Carr, and welcome to the Standing Committee on Industry, Science, and Technology. So I've read Bill C-235, and it's my understanding that this bill applies to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba only. Is that correct? Yes. So those three provinces are represented by 62 members of Parliament. And when we voted on this bill last June, 51 of those MPs voted against it, and only 10 voted in favor, with one MP abstaining. So the question has to be asked, why do you suppose this bill is so unpopular in the only 3 provinces that it actually affects?
I wouldn't say it's unpopular. I just haven't persuaded you yet. So I've got 52 minutes to try, and the framework will be constructed over 18 months, so there'll be lots more time to do it. I can't possibly explain why in the initial stage it didn't receive support from members of Parliament. But I do hope that when it's examined and the potential is assessed and some of the details are fleshed out, that there'll be more support than that. I could turn the question around and say, well, why did it pass in second reading? Because there were a number of members of Parliament who believed that it was in both the prairie and the national interest. But I'm just going to try harder to persuade you that it's good for our region.
Okay, fair enough. For years, provincial governments in Western Canada and in the oil and gas sector have been calling for more pipelines to get built, such as Keystone XL, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the Northern Gateway Pipeline. But this bill talks about prioritizing projects such as tree planting and solar energy. How will that help to get more pipelines built in Western Canada?
Well, the goal is not explicitly to build more pipelines in Western Canada. It's to look ahead at the next generation of developing the energy sector in our region of the country. And that's going to include sustainable development in the oil and gas industry. It's going to include hydrogen in Alberta. It's going to include biofuels across the region and all the traditional sources of alternate energy that is known or will be known to everybody. So it doesn't constrain the possibility of moving in well-known directions or in directions that we now know through experience and following the flow investment capital internationally that consumers are demanding worldwide. More sustainable energy development, and Canada is a part of it. Canada is actually on the cutting edge of it, and never, ever underestimate the entrepreneurship and the capacity of traditional sectors to adapt, to adjust, and to thrive. And I'm sure we're going to witness that.
So the provincial government of Saskatchewan is currently forecasting $4.7 billion in revenue from non-renewable resources for the current fiscal year. That's about 1/4 of the provincial government's budget. If that stream of revenues stops coming in from non-renewable resources, then how would you recommend the provincial government of Saskatchewan make up that budgetary shortfall?
I'm not going to give Premier Moe advice on how to run his government. I want to reach out to Premier Moe. And I have to admit that I'm sure if we try hard enough, we will find alignment, because his interest, the same as ours, is to create good jobs for his people, where those jobs can be found, where there can be generated, where the public environment will offer incentives for those jobs to be created. But just as there are those around this table who don't want the government of Canada to creep jurisdictionally, I'm not going to creep jurisdictionally into Premier Moe's territory.
Have you consulted with Premier Moe or any provincial cabinet ministers in Saskatchewan about this legislation?
No, but the committee will have to. I mean, if this becomes law, it won't be a suggestion, it'll be mandated, and not only that, they're going to have to report back to you. And you're going to have a chance to ask those questions. But it's clear what the goal is. The goal is that they will do exactly that, and they will look for alignment. Look, if there's no spirit of goodwill ultimately, a bill like this is not going to succeed. There has to be a sense that its objectives are honorable and in the interests of the people whom we represent. And those interests are rooted in the capacity of my kids and my grandkids to choose to stay in Manitoba, in your case, home. And that, I think, is really driving the heart of what we hope to accomplish here.
Okay, so I'm not saying that there isn't a sense of goodwill, but what are you going to do if the feedback from the provincial premiers is that they do not want this bill and they do not want this framework and they would rather govern their own provinces in their own areas of jurisdiction?
Well, this bill does not encroach on their areas of jurisdiction, and they're free to do so, and they should be encouraged to. It does, however, mandate federal ministers to seek alignment on those policy areas where we can combine our efforts. There is no attempt to undermine, to encroach, to somehow cajole. It's an exercise in finding common ground. And if someone says at the top end, we don't want to find common ground, we want to be left to our own jurisdiction, thank you very much, go home, well, that constrains the capacity of other jurisdictions or federal ministers to participate in what I hope to be a positive nation-building exercise. So let's see where the framework goes, how it's developed, and where the opposition lies and why, and seek to answer questions that are motivating people who may start here, but I hope will end up in a different place.
Thank you very much. On va maintenant passer à Madame Lapointe pour 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. Lapointe, for 6 minutes.
My colleague, MP Fillmore. MP Carr, the Rural Northern Immigration Program is a very successful program in Northern Ontario and helps our businesses with their workforce shortages and their labor needs. And it grew out of a very successful initiative in Atlantic Canada. So my question to you is, in your opinion, do you think this model that you're proposing would be relevant to other parts of Canada?
I do, and I'm glad you brought up immigration because actually it was my home province of Manitoba that initiated increases to the provincial nominee program. When we began our advocacy in 1999, Manitoba was taking in 500 provincial nominees a year. Now it's taking in more than 15,000. And it fueled the economic development of Manitoba. And that model has been replicated across the country and is thought by many to actually be a model for the world. So an extraordinary example of how creative and ambitious immigration targets and a change in the way in which we administer the program can allow us to take full advantage of our economic potential, which was not the case in Manitoba, was not the case in many parts of Atlantic Canada or in rural Canada. So I'm very glad that you brought up that example.
In reading the bill, there are many very good goals in that bill, but how do we ensure that the bill complements what's already happening in the prairies to build a green economy?
By assessing where we are and where we want to be, and then by aligning the interests of everybody around the table to work together to get there. And the successes are fabulous. The story of the development of Prairie Canada from so many perspectives is really a model, I would say, for the world, because we opened the door to the talent and the creativity and the entrepreneurship from every continent. And we had the wisdom, the savvy, to find a way to make those people so diverse to feel at home. And in the first place, it was agriculture that drove it, and then subsequently other industries. But if you look at the development of the demographic profile of Prairie Canada, you will see a success story that should help inform us as we move forward, as we debate immigration policy, as we debate temporary foreign worker issues, as we debate also, and this is an important role to play for us, how we relate to the rest of the world, because we have to diversify our trading partners. We're still so dependent on our relationship with the United States. But because of our profile, and because Saskatchewan, as an example, is the most diverse trading nation, province in Canada by far, doing business with so many nations around the world, that there are lessons there too. So you combine a progressive immigration policy with a trade policy that reaches out to those parts of the world where we have not been successful, and you have a recipe for very exciting potential.
That's the end of my questions.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I'll take up if there's still time. Jim, it's wonderful to see you, and congratulations on a wonderful PMB. I've been happy to support it so far, and I look forward to continuing to support it. You'll remember back when our government tabled a motion declaring a climate emergency, and I listened carefully as we debated that in the House to my Prairie colleagues, and to all of the debate. And what we learned from that debate is that even though that for many Canadians and even many corporations, including energy corporations, the existential threat is climate change. For a segment of the population and concentrated in the prairies, there's a segment of Canadians for whom the existential threat is loss of job, of not being able to pay a mortgage or to put food on the table. And I learned a lot from listening to that. Now you're here today to convince parliamentarians that there's a better way, a cleaner and greener way to transition. But if your bill passes, government and parliament will have to work with those residents to win them over and to show them a better way. And I wonder if you have any advice for us in that eventuality. How can we bring the people for whom the existential threat is economic along with us in this transition?
By the force of argument and by the use of measurable statistics that will be compelling to people who have an open mind and an open heart. If they've made up their mind, and if they're not interested in entertaining argument, that is to say, dissent from their own position, that I don't know. I mean, this is a question for the ages, right? What do you do in a conversation if nobody wants to listen to you? I happen to believe, and am just built in a way that wants to believe, that most Canadians are open to reasonable argument and debate. If that assumption is wrong, then I wish all of us luck. But I'm pretty certain that I'm not wrong, and I have lots of evidence to think that people do change their minds. They change their minds when circumstances change. If they don't care about circumstance, then I don't think they have an open mind, and I don't think they have an open heart. So I would remain optimistic based on that presumption of human nature, the Canadian national character, building on the success that we've already achieved together, and I hope I'm right.
I think you are, Jim. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Fillmore. Je passerai la parole à Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Carr, for your bill. We can feel the impact of your entire career on this, but also, how do I say, it's a type of dream. You know, and I think that this bill, well, what I think disappointing is that it's just for the prairies. I'm from a rural region. It's mines, forest, agriculture. This is really important. And I think there are many similarities between the prairies economy and my region. So I think that a similar bill should be a guideline on behalf of the government to be able to say, here is how we should reform the Canadian economy, the Quebec economy, and to look at the strength on the different territories. And we have to look at the tools for economic development that are unique to each region. And I'm very vexed to see that with the federal government, we're not able to build, where I'm from, a slaughterhouse, a simple slaughterhouse. It would make a huge difference for the 100, 200 beef producers in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. They have to do 8 hours of transport, 800 kilometers to bring their cattle to a slaughterhouse. And when we know of the impact on the environment, it's really a shame. So I believe that your bill actually could have a national scope, could be developed on a Canadian basis, because it could have an impact everywhere. We support this at the Bloc because we believe that this could lead to other reforms as well that could become levers for economic development throughout the country. And I would say quite sincerely that one of the bills that we have at the Bloc is to say this pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline that cost quite a few billions, I don't know, 18 billion, maybe even more now. Well, why wouldn't we sell this? And then this money, the profit or the money that we would make, could be used to try to create an economic development fund that would be used for the prairies. At the Bloc Québécois, we're saying, okay, as part of it, it would be our money that will have paid for the purchase of the pipeline, but if we sell it, it could be a lever for economic development that could fund research in universities, but that could fund green initiatives, such as the one that you're proposing. And this might be a first step that could implement a project such as yours. Here's my first question, though. When we talk about these funding tools, how do you perceive them? Is this through banks, insurance companies, the federal government? You talked about a cooperation with the provinces and municipalities, financial products outside the oil industry, I hope, if we are trying to diversify the economy.
The bill is not prescriptive because that would undercut the very idea that we spend these months determining what the priorities ought to be, building this framework. But let me agree with the premise of your introduction that this way of making decisions and of coming up with what I would hope to be enlightened public policy is not restricted to one region of the country. And if this is going to work in the prairie, which is as diverse as I've been suggesting, why wouldn't it work in other regions of the country, including Quebec? And I think it would. So this could be seen as a template. It can be seen as a way of experimenting with a new way of going about public policy making that could be equally applicable. I wouldn't have any comment to make about setting up a fund of economic development on the basis of selling an asset, but I would hope that the framework will include commentary on investment tools, ways in which we can properly fund the next chapter of energy development and sustainability in Prairie Canada. So what you're really doing is you're challenging the team of federal ministers, given the mandate, which will be part of Canadian law if this bill passes, in order to do exactly the kind of investigations that you're calling for.
Vous proposez plusieurs types.
You're proposing many different types of energy that could be of interest, including nuclear energy. Could you speak to this further? How nuclear energy could be used in the prairies?
We just didn't want to exclude anything by virtue of including it as a list of possibilities. The framework will establish recommendations on the precise way in which various sources of energy might be used, but it didn't make any sense to me, to those of us who are involved in drafting, to exclude any possible source of energy. Maybe it's there to be rejected by others at a later date, but it made no sense to leave it out, and that's why it's there, and let them have a go at it. Let them explore it. Let the controversy be joined. Let the debate be robust, as I'm sure it will be. We know people are of different views, but it was my judgment, and I still say it's a good judgment to make, to have a go and to have a debate. I think the country needs it. It's timely.
Ma dernière question est pourquoi?
My last question, why should we have to go through a bill such as this process? What's the value added if we look at other initiatives that are in place now? Why a bill?
Because I don't know that we can assume partnerships will happen all on their own. And I think to mandate the kind of conversations that will have to happen is to concentrate the public mind. And let me say the private mind too, because the role of the private sector in making these policies breathe life is essential. Without it, it's not going to happen. I mean, you're not going to have governments acting on their own to tackle all of the problems that our region is facing. So it has to be in concert with the academic community that's going to drive research and development, the private sector that's going to drive investment patterns, and the public policy environment that is the responsibility of government to set. So I think we have to have a certain amount of confidence that what we're creating here is going to allow for all of those conversations to happen in a way that's going to lead to a better result than we've had before. People will say, yeah, but you had all this time to do what it is that you want this bill to accomplish, but it hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? I'm not interested in why something hasn't happened. I'm interested in helping things happen. And that's what this bill seeks to do.
C'était la question que je n'osais pas vous poser. Merci beaucoup.
This was a question I didn't dare ask you. Thank you.
Us for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back, and as well, welcome, and thank you for your service over the years in Parliament. I'm going to go through kind of an idea here. Your summary talks about local cooperation, engagement, and a number of different things. So do you have any municipalities that are supporting this bill?
I've had conversations with mayors and reeves and organizations of municipalities, and I think that there is a consensus among them that to be a part of this kind of conversation in itself.
Okay, but no endorsements yet, but you...
I haven't sought endorsements. I mean, that's something that
In Saskatchewan, any provincial support from it? Any premiers or provincial explicit support from ministers?
Yeah, I haven't sought that.
Okay. How about First Nations?
Yes, I've had conversations with First Nations communities. They're mentioned explicitly in the bill.
Right, but have you an endorsement from them for the bill?
Well, again, I'm not seeking endorsements. I'm seeking agreement from this committee in the first place, and then subsequently by the House to mandate those conversations.
Do you have any citizen petitioners that have been in favor of the bill? Like, do you have petitions running or like public support?
Well, you're giving me a lot of great ideas, but as I say, I've not sought at this stage to do any of that.
Okay, well, here's the reason. I'm looking for consistency here, and this is the reason, because I have a private member's bill, C-248, that you voted against. And it's been accused by the government side, by some members, not all, that it was top-down. And I have, as conversed to yours, I have the City of Windsor's actually explicit endorsement for the bill, including the mayor and all of Canada unanimously. Same with the town of LaSalle. I have not only just the First Nations, Caldwell First Nations, which historically views this bill and my bill as part of their actual reconciliation process, who are supporting it explicitly. I have the province of Ontario that just passed a motion in the legislature in the first weeks of the House sitting in favor of what's taking place. I have thousands of petitioners. I have almost 10 years in the making of the entire idea for the National Urban Park. I have Unifor on side, the Windsor District Labour Council, and I also have the Wildland Leagues, NGOs, all universally opposed to it. I'm supportive of it. The only opposition comes from yourself and government members. So I want you to reflect on that. And if you're open, I just want to find out, what do you think is top-down? It appears that your bill here is a little more top-down than my bill, which actually comes from the community.
Well, I wouldn't purport to be able to compare these two bills from that perspective when the objective of my bill is to end up exactly where you are now.
Yeah, well,
we're just starting from different places.
Well,
So,
if we are, I started from the other place, so I'm just kind of curious as to, like, this is what, has been spoken in the House of Commons against my bill, is voted against by your members, and I still think that, I want to reflect on this in terms of the accusation that mine is top-down, whereas yours does not have explicit support from anyone yet, and this appears to be more top-down, and I think that's consistency that we need.
Fair enough.
Okay, well, I will move on with regards to canola. It's one of the things I think has been underestimated in the Canadian economy. Can you maybe highlight a little bit about how this could help with that? I know that we, in the past, had the wheat board that would push out policies and so forth. So that's changed over time. Canola has emerged as a very much a dominant staple market export. Maybe you can provide how this will help on an issue like that in a more practical sense.
I think it just underlines the importance of converting our natural resources not only into traditional sources of energy, but also into alternate sources of energy in demand worldwide. We produce much of it. We have to be more aggressive in the way we market it, and that's an obstacle. And when I was Minister of Trade, you notice they added the word diversification. I was Minister of Trade Diversification, as Shannon knows. We traveled around the world looking for new markets, and there was a reluctance among Canadian entrepreneurs to get out of their comfort zone. We speak the same language as the Americans. They're comfortable. We've done business with them forever. Business was okay, and people were risk averse. They shouldn't be risk averse. They should embrace the challenge. And you say canola is a good example of that, and I agree with you.
With regards to transportation of goods and services to the product of destination for international trade, often pipelines is focused on, but the other alternative, or not alternative, but other mode of transportation is CP, CN. There's container issues right now. I know that in the number of different areas that they're not getting out to the different markets. Is this a form where transportation to market can also be addressed?
Absolutely. You may have read the one example. You know, there hasn't been a train to move from Calgary to Edmonton since 1985. You probably know, members around this table will know, that bus service is almost unavailable in Prairie Canada. The airline connections are inadequate, to say the least. So who's grabbing that? This could easily be a forum where the interests come to the table and say, this is unacceptable. I mean, our people, imagine seniors in rural Prairie Canada trying to go from one place to another, and there's nothing available to them. Who's debating it? Who's looking for public policy solutions? This offers them an opportunity.
And lastly, Mr. Chair, with regards to the groups and organizations I referenced at the start, do you think that there's many out there that want to testify to this committee, and do you have a list to help us to gain access to those, I guess, organizations, whether they be municipal, provincial, First Nations, and so forth, and you can provide that?
Glad to work with you on the lists. Happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you to the witness.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Mrs. Stubbs.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you again, and enjoyed working with you on the Public Safety Committee. And Mr. Carr, nice to see you again. I did enjoy working both with and against you on natural resources issues over your years as Natural Resources Minister, and also want to recognize your service both in Manitoba and to Canada, and it's nice to see you in person and well. Now, far be it for me to be surprised today to agree with an NDP member from Ontario, but I'm just here to speak on behalf of the Alberta constituents that I represent. Following up both on the point that our colleague made from Ontario and also our Conservative colleague here from Saskatchewan, I think your bill, 7 years into the Liberals being in government, is actually quite a negative commentary on this federal government's track record on negotiating and consulting with prairie provinces. It seems to me that your aspiration and intentions, which I know are good, in this legislation would actually imply that consultation so far between the various levels of government has been ineffective or lacking. And I guess what I'm curious about is how sort of do you reconcile what you clearly have identified as a need for this sort of legislation against a federal government which is, for example, facing lawsuits from all three provincial governments on the carbon tax, on the shipping ban C-48, on the No More Pipelines Bill C-69, which also will have major consequences, of course, not just for resource projects, but all kinds of other economic development. Those three issues, of course, which the vast majority of prairie representatives who happen to sit federally in the Conservative caucus, as well as those prairie provincial representatives, say are among the top threats destroying economic development in their provinces and for their citizens and the livelihoods of the people that I represent. It just seems that you are asking for a thing, you're asking for a committee and politicians to create a framework and a mandate, which I'm assuming is going to cost something, to enable a process to occur, which clearly already should be happening. But we are sitting here where we are in reality with a federal government that is being opposed on all kinds of major pieces of legislation and their policy agenda by those very provinces.
Well, we all could look backwards together and determine where we've gone wrong, and we might even agree. But that's not what I want to do. I want to look forward, and I want to take accomplishments where we can find them and parlay them into a bit of a roadmap, acknowledging that there have been mistakes made. There are relationships that should have been developed that haven't been developed. I spent, I guess most of 2 years on the second floor of my house on my little computer, traversing the prairie. And you know what I found? That in spite of all of the noise and all the confusion about political messaging, I found alignment everywhere, and including in Alberta. And I was surprised by it, not only because of some demographic changes that have occurred over the last number of years, but because the very nature of the way in which we organize ourselves as provinces has changed. And I was surprised that in the course of a day where I can, through the magic of my Super Pro, not getting on an airplane, I could visit the cattle ranchers in the morning and talk to the Chamber of Commerce at lunch, and then talk to power producers in the afternoon. And I would come out of that day and I could say, oh my goodness, we agreed on 4 or 5 things. Why isn't anybody talking about the agreement across unions, industry, academe, government officials, lots of important conversations with ministers of the Alberta government, as an example, on issues that really matter. So,
but I think.
Go ahead.
This is sort of what is confusing about this initiative. Those provinces, their federal representatives, their provincial representatives, those citizens, by and large, are speaking loud and clear about all kinds of these consequential aspects of the cornerstone of this Liberal government's policy agenda, and are being ignored. So I guess the Liberals can take up your individual initiative to consult, but if that two-way dynamic and actually listen to what is being told continues to be ignored, then we will gain nothing. And I think the central issue with this bill is, if we need this bill, then that's an indictment on the current government. And if the government wants to contend that consultation is already happening, then it's not necessary. And also about your aim, of course, in greening the economy, you and I have had this conversation many times. I agree with you wholeheartedly about the stereotypes that are applied to various provinces. And it's a passion of mine to bust myths about Alberta, which of course was the first province to have an environment minister, the first province to set, report, and regulate emissions, the first province to have a major industrial emitter levy targeted to clean tech. It is the oil and gas industry, of course, accounts for 75% of investment in this country for clean tech. Alberta's the biggest hydrogen producer. We have the biggest. We have the first province with 100% renewable energy powered LRT. We have the largest contiguous green space. We have the oldest commercial wind farm. We have the oldest and largest commercial solar farm. The reality is that in the province of Alberta, this environmental stewardship leadership has been happening already because of the public policy agenda of the provincial governments, a thriving private sector fueled by energy and agriculture, so that money is available to invest in technology. And also development, I guess to your point, actually, a cooperative development of public policy framework to allow these things to happen, just like when the Prime Minister Chrétien worked with Premier Klein to bring in some fiscal policies to unleash the development of in-situ oil sands projects. But here we are now with 4 pipelines having been killed because of the regulatory mistakes of this Liberal government, with 18 LNG projects that have gone by the wayside, killing Canada's opportunity to be both self-sufficient and a world-leading provider of LNG across the country. And I notice even in your bill, you are prioritizing nuclear. I agree wholeheartedly with you. But the sitting environment minister isn't interested in that. So I think this is the challenge. We probably all agree with the aspirations, but like what's happening actually in real life and with the conduct of this Liberal government, I don't think gives Albertans very much confidence.
I love the middle part.
Let you respond. I'm sure you'll have other opportunities. We're way over time, but I wanted to give space to the passion that I think you both have for the prairies. But we'll get back to you, Mr. Carr, for sure. So we'll go now to Mr. Erskine Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks for being here and for your work putting this bill together. I've introduced a few private members' bills in my 7 years, and some successful, some not. But I always find when you've tabled something, there's something you wish you'd changed, or something you thought a little bit more about, and you could have tweaked something. And if you had another go at it, you would have changed it just so very differently. And so I wonder, when you look at the bill now, many months after you'd originally worked with the legislative drafters to put it together, are there particular areas that we should be looking at to improve the bill?
The Minister of Agriculture should be specifically named as an implicated minister. Should have been, wasn't. Let's change it. I think, colleagues, that 18 months might be too long. So maybe we should think about making it a year, just to give the impetus for speedier work. So those are two examples of where I think we could streamline and tighten. And directly to your question, I've thought about those two issues quite a lot since the bill was tabled. So I would be happy if we bumped up the involvement, the participation, and the naming of the Minister of Agriculture, and we reduced the time necessary for the framework from 18 months to 1 year.
And in terms of the minister, the relevant minister will remain the Minister of Industry in your view? Are there other ministers? You mentioned the agriculture minister will be named. Presume in Section 5 of the report, the minister must, in collaboration with environment, transport, finance, natural resources, and we would name agriculture there is what you said, I think. Is there any minister that you think to be incorporated to this legislation?
Yes, the minister in charge of prairies and Western economic development should be very much a part of it, even leading it. I think there have been some discussions with the ministry to see that that can happen. Somebody will have to draft an appropriate amendment, but that certainly would be fine with me.
And how do you see, and this relates to sort of the question that Shannon was asking you, because on the one hand, we can acknowledge major efforts by Albertans and by industry in Alberta to advance emission reductions and to work together both to grow the economy but to do their part. At the same time, as a country, and this includes Alberta, but more broadly, we aren't yet doing enough. And I think there is more to be done. And so how do you square this idea of respecting the traditional energy industries that Shannon wants us to respect to a great degree, while also moving to a net zero economy? And you've said very clearly that foster job creation and retraining, for example, in regions that rely on traditional energy industries to enable them to build a zero emissions green economy and mitigate their impact on climate change. And is that's B, that's 3 sub B in the bill. Do you think, have you seen opposition to that suggestion that we should be moving away from traditional energy industries to enable a zero emissions green economy in the prairies? Or do you see that being welcomed by industry in the prairies?
I see lots of evidence that it's being welcomed. And we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of leaders in that industry to lead the way. They are sensitive in detail that you and I wouldn't run into to the movement of capital flows internationally. They know how to anticipate markets. They can read the changing sentiment in the public policy environment, in the political environment, in the funding environment. So what do? You take advantage of that expertise and that spirit, and you work with it. And I know there are all kinds of examples where that's happening right now. So I have, it's not just faith, I think it's interest that the established industries know what their balance sheets are going to look like in a year. They speculate what they'll look like in 5 years. They're in the business of anticipating trends, and their livelihoods depend on it. And they also have the capacity to invest in their instinct and in their assessment of on-the-ground realities in their world. So what do? You don't set them up as opponents. You embrace them as allies. And that really, if I had to give a bottom line to this bill, let's embrace our allies.
Thanks, Jim. I'm out of time. I just want to say, and I wish Shannon I was there in person with you. You don't just have to work to agree with an NDP member from Ontario. You can agree with a Liberal member from Ontario on occasion too. But it's nice to see everyone.
Merci. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes 30.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carr, in the north of the prairies, there is a lot of vacant land. It could be tempting for the government to plant billions of trees, but if we want to have a sustainable economic plan, also we have to look at agriculture. Wouldn't you see the relevance of having a funding program to allow the startups for the agricultural sector for vacant lands?
And I would hope, given what I've just said about the importance of agriculture as the essence of what we're trying to accomplish here in the naming of the minister, that is exactly the kind of idea that I don't think has had a full airing. So many of these issues have had no airing, and this is a chance to pump a little bit of air in that tire and for people to be accountable for it. I don't want to diminish the importance of reporting back to you. And as a parliamentarian, I know that if I have a deadline, and that deadline means that I have to have my ducks in a row to talk to a parliamentary committee or the whole of Parliament, I'm going to take it seriously. And I have to take it seriously, and I should. And the difference between what Shannon has talked about as a 7-year legacy is that now we're compelled. If this becomes law, there is a mandate and a compulsion to do the things that she wants done. And by the way, in the middle part of your intervention, when you reviewed all of the accomplishments within Alberta towards a sustainable energy future, I was just nodding my head. So why can't we do more of that? Why can't those accomplishments become better known? And that's what we're doing. So rather than bemoan the fact that these kinds of things ought to be acted upon, let's agree and get a move on. And then know that within 18 months or 12 months, if you agree with this possible amendment, that actually there's going to be an accounting, and there should be.
Étant donné que j'ai abusé à ma première question, je vais me permettre de...
I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
J'apprécie. La parole est à Monsieur Moss pour 2 minutes 30.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So one quick question. With regards to, I guess, the financing of the bill in terms of costs and stuff like that, has there been any kind of, evaluation of that, or where, you got several ministers it goes through here, and to your credit, you have those ministers on side. They voted to get it here, so, I mean, I've questioned about the other, support, but at the same time, you have their support. So is there any kind of structure lead from the various ministers that are named in the report, and how it, I guess one of the concerns that might be expressed is that it might slow other types of economic development parts down or whatever, like conflict or so forth along that lines. Like who takes the lead kind of so it doesn't accidentally get in the way of things? Or
yeah. An interesting story, by the way, about why the minister in charge of Prairie Can wasn't named in the first place. The drafters say that you have to have statutory authority to be named as a lead minister, and that ministry didn't have statutory authority, but apparently there are ways in which that can be corrected. Again, it would be awfully presumptuous to anticipate what all of this is going to yield over time, but there's no attempt here to create any kind of mechanism for duplication or for money to be spent that doesn't play directly to the framework. So the first step is to establish the framework, and then we take a half a step back and we say, what are the implications of the framework moving forward? And I don't think we can answer that question yet.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, the witness. I can take the time up if I need to.
Caught me off guard.
Chair,
Cauliflower.
hope you're enjoying.
So thank you, Mr. Massa.
Thank you again, Mr.
This is the one time I would have liked you to use the whole time.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll move to Mr. Mazzi for 5 minutes.
Thank
Welcome, Mr. Carr. I have to be honest, though. Anytime your government starts talking about introducing legislation about the prairies, I do worry. Your government believes in an Ottawa knows best type of approach, something that I do strongly oppose. Whether it be your government's carbon tax or whether fertilizer restrictions, your government claims to be helping the prairies when in reality your government is really hurting them. Have the premiers of Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta publicly supported your bill? Yes or no?
I have not asked the premiers to support the bill. Presumably, they will be right at the top of the list of the implicated ministers if this should become law. But let me make a comment that may surprise you. You know, I spent all those months traversing the prairie, however virtually, and I was asked to explain why we do so badly. We, the Liberal Party, in Prairie Canada. And it's a source of constant frustration to me personally as a prairie dweller, someone who's lived in the region all my life, representing both a provincial constituency in Manitoba and a federal one in Parliament. And I offer the same kind of common sense analysis that anybody else would. We failed continuously in aligning our political interests to the real interests of prairie folk. And it's demonstrable. Just look at the results. Look at the numbers. I'm going to try to sugarcoat the results. They're real. Delighted that we won a couple of seats in Alberta on a partisan note, but we didn't win any in Saskatchewan. Keeps me up at night. And the only way that you can penetrate that kind of dislocation is by opening your ears, by advancing policy suggestions that are important to the daily lives of people who live in these provinces, and to show up and to be there often and with both ears wide open. Clearly, we have not done that, and we've paid the political price time and time again. So I hope we can change that. I'm not here to make any partisan commentary whatsoever. I'm here to look at the interests of the people who live in these provinces and to try to better align our policies to make their lives more fruitful.
If the premiers all speak against the bill, will you withdraw it?
It's not up to me to withdraw the bill, and it's not up to me to conduct a referendum among premiers. The consultative process will put at the top of the list conversations with ministers and premiers to see if they can find alignment. If they can't find any alignment, I would be disappointed. Maybe they didn't try hard enough. But the answer to your question is I don't think that's the way it works.
This is a bill coming from Ottawa legislating how the prairies build a new green economy. However, just a few years ago, your government rejected the Manitoba Green Plan, a plan that was developed by Manitobans for Manitobans. Why do you believe that Ottawa knows better than Manitoba?
I don't know that Ottawa knows better. I do know that we have an obligation to better understand what Manitoba wants, not only as expressed by their premier or their government, because just as you may not like what you call a top-down approach from the federal government, nor would many Manitobans, may I add, like a top-down approach from the provincial government. They would want to know that the provincial government is bending over backwards to have a better understanding of what Manitobans believe to be in the interests as we plot the next chapter of Manitoba economic history. So I would say top-down can be applied to any government, not just the national one.
So I guess that it really doesn't matter if the premiers don't agree with it or anything like that. It doesn't really matter because it's going to be a top-down approach anyways. Mr. Carr, Bill C-235 mandates that the framework to build greener prairie economy must involve various ministers. However, you've already mentioned it has zero mention of the agriculture minister, and you're going to include that. Was this just a simple, did you forget to include Canadian farmers and ranchers in your bill, or is your government once again intentionally just forgetting about them?
It was an oversight for which I take total responsibility and seek to redress.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Gahir for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carr, pleasure. And congratulations on your private member's bill. So my first question is, I know you haven't sought, in your own words, you haven't sought endorsements, but could you speak to the level of grassroots support you've seen for this bill?
During the course of my many months talking to reeves, mayors, canola producers, ranchers, virtually every interest that in combination make up the backbone of the prairie economy, I heard people say that they want a seat at the table. And this is a quote from so many. They want a seat at the table. Well, they're going to get a seat at the table. So rather than anticipating what it is they might say, though I have a pretty good idea through these many, many months of talking with them, better that the implicated federal ministers hear directly. And I know that these will be direct, sometimes very honest and painfully honest conversations that will lead only to better places, because the level of understanding, and it plays right to the political questions that have been asked. And when you are able to take that kind of attitude towards a series of discussions with people who make the prairie economy tick literally from the ground up, only good can come of it.
Great, thank you. So if this bill were to become law, there would be a consultation phase to develop a framework. Can you talk about how the bill will ensure that everyone feels welcome to the table and actually shows up, including minorities and Indigenous peoples?
Because that's what the bill seeks to do, and it's direct not only in the naming of examples, but also in the spirit of what it intends to accomplish. So if people were left out of the process, then they'd have every reason to say that the spirit of the bill is not being lived in real time and in real life, and that would make me very unhappy.
So when critics review this bill, perhaps one of the questions raised is, more regulation means more red tape. Is that what the bill means?
It doesn't imply more regulation. It may imply less. That would be presupposing that the consultation process will yield this result and that. It doesn't seek to do that. It just says, I think and I hope in pretty simple terms, that these partnerships don't necessarily happen on their own. There may be a motivation or an ambition of a single minister or of a single industry or of a single union to accomplish this set of goals, but unless there's a way of rationalizing, of consolidating, of trying to find ways where we pull out of all of the special interest, a common interest, and a public interest, will we, I think, perform the kind of work that I envisage as the best possible implication of this bill. As I said to Mr. Massa a while ago, the range of impact is from zero to changing the way we do business as a country. And as I said to the Bloc member, Monsieur Lemire, equally applicable to other regions. So I start, this is not Pollyanna, by the way. This is not just an aspirational exercise. It's pragmatic, because the results ought to be good jobs for our people. And which stakeholder at any level of government or in the private sector would disagree with that? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, ça conclut nos rondes.
Thank you. This concludes our rounds of questioning. Thank you so much, Mr. Carr, for your presence before the committee. Congratulations for your private member's bill. That will continue its progress. It's not the first time that I hear you speak with as much passion, intelligence, and enthusiasm from the prairies. And it's always a pleasure to hear you speak. I believe that it's very inspirational for many regions of Canada, as was mentioned during the meeting. Thank you.
We let you all guys go and we adjourn this meeting. We have a motion on notice, which I think all parties are aware of, and which reads as follows: that the clerk of the committee be authorized to grant access to the committee's digital binder to the offices of the whips of each recognized party. Do I have unanimous consent for this motion? I do. Perfect. So thank you very much. And this meeting is adjourned.